Hello, I'm Nergis Canefe, and I'm a professor of politics, public policy, and law at York University, Toronto, Canada. Welcome to a 5-part podcast series on phenomenology of violence and its contemporary applications. This series has been supported by York University, their project funding, and it is organized in tandem with the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, Austria. Land acknowledgement for York University recognizes that many indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University thus acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Episode 5: Contemporary Debates on Phenomenology of Violence. In this last episode, we will briefly visit some of the works of contemporary scholars who excel in the area of phenomenology of violence. Though they engage different perspectives, all feed from the sources of Patocka, Arendt, Husserl, and other thinkers who are known figures in the phenomenological tradition. In this episode, we'll have a brief look at some of the contemporary scholarship on phenomenology of violence, with the hope that its applications will become more widespread. We'll start with Sara Ahmed's A Phenomenology of Whiteness, which was published in Feminist Theory in the year 2007. But prior to that, we should of course cite Jacques Derrida's Violence and Metaphysics, published back in 1978 in the volume Levinas, Phenomenology and His Critics. In more contemporary times, Michael Staudigl's name stands out in the studies of phenomenology of violence. Professor Staudigl is the head of research and a lecturer at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Vienna, Austria. He has published many books and articles in the field of phenomenology and its interdisciplinary applications. Professor Staudigl is also a member of the Research Center on Religion and Transformation in Contemporary Society at the Faculty of Theology in the same university. Worthy of note, between 2000 and 2002, he worked as a scientific assistant at the Psychotraumatological Ambulance in Vienna. He was a senior visiting fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, otherwise known as IWM, between the years 2003 and 2010, and since 2017, he has been conducting several research grants funded by the Austrian Science Fund. His major areas of research are phenomenology, especially Husserlian phenomenology, contemporary French phenomenology, phenomenology of the body, non-foundational phenomenologies of the social world, through which he seeks to apply phenomenological analysis on questions of violence and, most recently, religious violence. In his work on a phenomenological theory of violence, Professor Staudigl lays the groundwork for developing a thoroughgoing phenomenological description of different aspects of violence, such as physical, psychic, and structural violence. His overall aim is to provide a subject-centered approach to violence within the social sciences and humanities, with an integrative theoretical framework. His work is essential for the formulation of a phenomenologically grounded theory of violence. He also elaborates on relational phenomenology of violence, and his theoretizations explore the constitution of all sense in its intrinsic relation with our embodiment and intercorporality. In the introduction to the topics, problems, and potentials of a phenomenological analysis of violence, Michael Staudigl argues that there is no violence per se. Rather, there is violence only to the extent that there are historically and culturally constituted, and thus irreducibly contingent orders within which the meaning of violence is ascribed to a given social event. He argues that violence should not be taught as something independent of its agents, recipients, and observers, and we cannot carve out some essential traits of violence in its overall significance for a given socio-political and cultural order. His analysis implies that violence is to be taught as a social phenomenon within the horizon of its ordering, within which we negotiate, define, and debate what counts and is recognized as violence and what does not. Every analysis of violence hence necessitates an analysis of those orders of violence in which the sovereign right of defining what is violent and what is not violent is embodied. In his more recent work on the phenomenology of religious violence, Professor Staudigl argues that we need to analyze religious violence in the post-secular context and in a novel way, rather than analyzing violence in terms of irrationality, senselessness, atavism, or monstrosity, terms which are strongly endorsed by the contemporary theater of cruelty committed in the name of religion. We also need to understand it in terms of an originary supplement of disengaged reason. In order to confront its specificity beyond traditional explanations of violence, Professor Staudigl proposes an integrated phenomenological account of religion that traces the phenomenality of religion in terms of a correlation between the originary givenness of transcendence and the human creative capacities to respond to it. Following Paul Ricoeur, he discusses religious violence in terms of a monopolizing appropriation of that originary source of givenness. The second contemporary scholar we should mention in terms of current debates on the phenomenology of violence is Professor James Dodd. James Dodd is a professor and chair of philosophy at the New School for Social Research, New York, United States. His areas of concentration are Husserl, Heidegger, and phenomenology in general. In his own words, he cites that he turned to philosophy when he realized that there were common questions that drive very different kinds of disciplines, from anthropology to mathematics, from history to the natural sciences. And he says he became dedicated to philosophy both as a researcher and a teacher when he learned just how powerfully and rigorously these questions could be articulated in a philosophical conversation. He suggests that philosophy does not replace the diversity of intellectual pursuits, but it does illuminate the common horizon of questioning that all of these disciplines share, for they all equally engage with fundamental questions such as who are we, what is just, what is truth, what is the world. He thus believes philosophy is essential to any education in both the arts and the sciences, as it provides the best hope for a grasp of the comprehensive meaning of education itself. Professor Dodd published extensively on Husserl's work, as well as on the issue of violence and phenomenology. In his Crisis and Reflection, an essay on Husserl's crisis of the European sciences. He argues that, in this last work, Edmund Husserl formulated a radical new approach to phenomenological philosophy. Unlike his previous works, in The Crisis, Husserl embedded this formulation in an ambitious reflection on the essence and value of the idea of rational thought and culture, a reflection that he considered to be an urgent necessity in light of the political, social, and intellectual crises of the interwar period. In this book, James Dodd pursues an interpretation of Husserl's text that emphasizes the importance of the problem of the origin of philosophy, as well as advancing the thesis that, for Husserl, the crisis of reason is not a contingent historical event, but a permanent feature of a life in reason generally. In his 2009 book, Violence and Phenomenology, James Dodd pursued the problem of whether violence can be understood to be constitutive of its own sense or meaning, as opposed to being merely instrumental to something else. He drew on the resources of phenomenological philosophy and took the form of a series of dialogues between figures both inside and outside of this tradition in his writing. The central figures considered include Carl von Clausewitz, Carl Schmitt, Hannah Arendt, Jean-Paul Sartre, Ernst Jünger, and Martin Heidegger. And the study aptly concludes with an analysis of the philosophy of Jan Patocka. Following up on his previous book, James Dodd published Phenomenological Reflections on Violence, a Skeptical Approach in 2017. In this later work, he presents an expanded and deepened reflection on the problem of violence again. The book's 6 essays are guided by a skeptical philosophical attitude about the meaning of violence that refuses to conform to the exigencies of essence and the stable patterns of lived experiences. Each essay tracks a discoverable and sometimes familiar figure of violence, while at the same time questioning its limits and revealing sides of its resistance to conceptualization. These essays read as reflections, attempts at interpretation, as much as they are attempts to push concepts of violence to their limits. They again draw upon a range of different authors, including Sartre, Levinas, Schelling, Scheller, and Husserl, and historical moments, but without any attempt to reduce these into a series of examples elucidating a comprehensive theory of violence. James Dodd's noteworthy works also include Philosophy in Dark Times, an essay on Jan Patocka's philosophy as history, which was published in 2015. Another noteworthy scholar is the French sociologist Michel Wieviorka, who was born in 1946. Wieviorka is noted for his work on violence, terrorism, racism, social movements, as well as his theory of social change. He was the 16th president of International Sociological Association between the years 2006 and 2010. Michel Wieviorka is the son of a Polish-Jewish family of Holocaust survivors and a former student of Alain Touraine. He is one of the most renowned sociologists and public intellectuals in France and abroad of the last century. Many of his books have been translated into different languages, and he received international attention as an expert following the 2005 civil unrest in France. Together with Alain Touraine, Wieviorka developed the method of intervention sociologique and employed it to the study of militant social movements, in particular French anti-nuclear activism and student leagues, but also the famous trade union Solidarność in Poland. Following Max Weber's classical concept of interpretative sociology, Wieviorka aims at understanding the subjective rationale of actors in the context of larger social conflicts. Wieviorka's article, published in Thesis 11 back in 2003, titled Violence and the Subject, is a noteworthy example of his rich analysis of violence. In that piece, he argues that violence confronts us increasingly and everywhere, just like Jan Patocka did. And he asked the question of how are we to make sense of it? The ubiquity of violence begs the question of analytical differentiation. And thus, Wieviorka seeks to open the field by suggesting a fivefold typology: violence as loss of meaning, violence as nonsense, violence as cruelty, fundamental violence, and founding violence. The idea of analytically differentiating between types of violence cannot avoid the fact that sometimes victims are also perpetrators in other ways, and that even violent activity is not conducted only by essentially violent subjects or violent means. Violence needs to be connected to modernity and to problems of identity formation, and not only to personal or collective aberrations and risks. Another noteworthy scholar who engages in discussions of violence and uses the phenomenological perspective is Matthias Thaler. Thaler is a professor of political theory in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Edinburgh. His main research interests are in contemporary political theory. He regularly teaches courses on democratic theory, populism, human rights, and the morality of war and violence. He currently serves as co-director of research in the School of Social and Political Sciences. Thaler's most recent work is No Other Planet, published by Cambridge University Press in 2022, which was preceded by Naming Violence, published in 2018. With co-editor Mihaela Mihai, he published Political Violence and the Imagination in 2020, as well as the book on the uses and abuses of political apologies in 2014. In his Naming Violence, A Critical Theory of Genocide, Torture and Terrorism, Thaler articulates a novel perspective on the study of violence that demonstrates why the imagination matters for political theory. He explores how narrative art, thought experiments, and historical events can challenge and enlarge our existing ways of thinking about violence. Thaler's impressive and insightful politics of naming demonstrates how historically grounded appreciation of violence's protean character may be linked to an orienting of normativity. He sheds light not just on the problem of violence, but also on fundamental issues such as the role that imagination plays in reasoning and the nature of political judgment. Indian scholar Anat Sharma and her work on violence and phenomenology, which was published in Procedia Social and Behavioral Sciences, is worthy of mention here as well. She is based at JNU, New Delhi, India, at the Department of Philosophy. Sharma argues that the issue of violence has been approached differently in various disciplines of social sciences, and the ethical approach to the discourse of violence has often been ignored and thus need our attention more so than other approaches. How the body subject experiences the presence of violence as a ubiquitous phenomenon prevalent in the lived world is her key question. She makes a distinction between grand narratives and small narratives within the discourse of violence in order to comprehend the operationality of violence in our intersubjective world. She looks at various discourses of social sciences on violence and how they have not dealt with the issue adequately, And she argues that violence has been understood in terms of finding causes and consequences of the event of violence, rather than as an experience that affects the intentionality of an individual. She posits violence needs to be looked at as a phenomenon rather than as an abstract concept, and that violence is experienced by the subject in one's everyday existence when one is engaged with the world. How an individual makes sense of the lived world and one's existence within the pre-given structures of the lived world. To have the holistic picture of violence, one not only has to look at various structures of the lived world, but also at different relations that an individual shares with the pre-given intersubjective world. The ideas of Christian Ciocan are of great importance in the context of contemporary debates on phenomenology of violence as well. Professor Ciocan is currently a member of the Graduate School in Philosophy at the University of Bucharest and a researcher at the Institute of the University of Bucharest. He is the president of the Romanian Society for Phenomenology, which was founded in 2000, and editor-in-chief of the journal Studia Phenomenologica. Towards a multimodal phenomenological approach of violence, Christian Ciocan argues that violence is a pervasive dimension of our individual and social existence. The unanimous feeling that we are living in an increasingly violent world, full of rage and anger, is more and more tormenting. Not only our past is full of violence, but also our present. Moreover, we cannot have high expectations regarding a peaceful future, he argues. There is no need to mention the countless instances of violence worldwide, each one having its own grounds and justifications, and simultaneously generating new violences, with their always particular contexts and their multi-stratified implications, in order to enhance our what Ciocan calls catastrophic sensitivity. Even for those who are somewhat sheltered from actual aggression, just seeing it on the media from a quasi-safe distance, violence is still an indisputable and a deeply disturbing presence. In this particular article, Ciocan explores the emotional dimensions involved in the phenomenon of interpersonal violence, identifying various modalizations of affectivity occurring in the architectonics of this phenomenon. He concentrates on symmetrical violence, namely on the emergence of irritation, annoyance, anger, and fury, leading to fierce confrontation. Then he moves on to explore asymmetrical violence, where the passive pole experiences the imminence of others' violence in fear and is terrified and traumatized. He then focuses on the experience of the third in the face of violence, showing that here the affectivity is differently constituted each time, depending on the various situations of symmetrical or asymmetrical violence that the third party witnesses. He contrasts the experience of real violence with the experiences of violence as image, and he poses several questions regarding the modifications of the affective aspect of violence in those changed circumstances. Ciocan argues that our current experiences of violence are not predominantly violence given in the flesh, but violence given through the mediation of imagery. The phenomenon of real violence is therefore modified through the imaginations and experiences of imaginations, evolving its emotional, embodied, and intersubjective dimensions. How is the emotion of violence constituted in the face of depicted violence in contrast to lived and remembered experiences of violence? Is the intersubjectivity modified when symmetrical or asymmetrical violence appears pictorially? What specific embodied dimensions are engaged when violence is lived through an image and not as a real phenomenon? This phenomenon of imagistic violence, he argues, can also be understood in contrast with the experience of violence lived in fantasy, memory, remembrance, or dreaming. Each type of image puts into play certain possibilities of violence, making it also possible various subjective experiences of violation. And thus it is crucial to explore how these experiences fundamentally depend on the types of images by which the phenomenon of violence is depicted and delivered. Another Eastern European scholar who works on the phenomenology of violence is Ion Copoeru at the Babeş-Bolyai University. He is a senior researcher at the Center of Applied Philosophy at the same university. In his work on Event and Structure, a phenomenological approach of irreducible violence, Copoeru argues that violence is signaled by a Markov discontinuity, interruption, and rupture. This tripartite temporality of violence, with its strong focus on the present, points to the originary violence. Moreover, he argues that the violent event is structuring the order of the action sequences in an actual, violent, embodied interaction. The interactional dynamics in violent encounters between co-present actors shapes the specific forms of the experiencing in and of the violent interaction. Based on how violence is experienced in an interactive situation, the phenomenon of violence articulates itself according to three coordinates: directness, co-performativity, and decapabilization. Copoeru argues that the outlining of the structure of the lived experiences of violence is revealing something irreducible in it. To understand the experience of violence as such, he proposes that we accept the idea of violence per se and depart from that view which claims the acts of violence are essentially moral choices and actions. The core of the ethical moral discussion concerning violence should thus be grounded instead on the moment of conversion identifiable when we take into account the reaction to violence. Professor Kavita Kumar at the University of Delhi Department of Philosophy made distinct contributions to the phenomenology of caste violence. In the piece titled Political Meanings of Atrocity, Phenomenology of Caste Violence, Kumar argues that the philosophical understanding of atrocity may provide not only the political and moral meanings, but also captures the phenomenon of violence, since its method is descriptive, evaluative, and emancipative. Kumar states that the phenomenon of caste violence as an atrocity has multi-layered and multiple meanings, as it involves multiple actors and agencies, and the act of the specific violence is both relational and intentional. The phenomenological understanding of caste violence may thus provide diverse vantage points in understanding the term atrocity. The same act of caste violence, victim, perpetrator, police, judiciary, and the state provide different accounts and different approaches, so the political meaning of the event varies. The perpetrator, the caste Hindu, justifies this act of violence by pointing out the violation of the social norm by the Dalits themselves. Violence therefore imposes one interpretative framework and destroys the other interpretive framework, that of the victims. Kumar states that we are able to find different descriptions of the same act of caste violence in different registers. Negating the discourse of other positions, we may then use them to morally and politically strengthen the position of the underprivileged, the voiceless, the subaltern, and the victim by exposing these narratives. The political meaning evolved from this kind of encounter may negotiate intersubjective veracity of objectively just norms. To explore a socially constituted intersubjective meaning of the atrocity may then facilitate better understandings of the social world and may provide a framework for changing the social world from alternative moral and political grounds. Catherine Sophia Bell, formerly known as Catherine Gines, is an American philosopher. She's an associate professor of philosophy at Penn State University, and much of her work is focused on increasing diversity within philosophy. She's also the founding director of the Collegium of Black Women Philosophers. Her work, titled Hannah Arendt and the Negro Question, published in 2014, has been widely cited as a very important debate on the issue of perception of violence. Another American scholar, Thomas Beaumont, at Texas A&M University San Antonio, introduced the concept of phenomenology of redemptive violence. In his work published in the journal Alternatives in 2020, he argues that when we occupy the spaces of war memorials, we respond with certain bodily comportments that relay the truth of those killed by violence in war. Through a phenomenological examination of embodied responses to two war memorials, that of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall and the tomb of the unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery, Beaumont argues that social institutions employ bodies as a means of legitimizing a violence that is seen as redemptive. More specifically, he argues how the redemptive quality of certain types of violence is actually an assumption replicated in social practices where individuals have learned that particular bodily skills of discourses surrounding redemptive violence should be perpetuated. David Polizzi, an associate professor of criminology and criminal justice in Indiana State University in the United States, introduced the term righteous slaughter in the context of phenomenological analysis. He provides a powerful phenomenological description of the experience of crime, which is ontologically situated again within the social world from which it emerges. As such, the experience of crime is viewed as neither an exclusive psychological artifact of a self-enclosed and finished rational actor, or as the epiphenomenal conclusion of a process of a structurally imposed determinism. From his perspective, the experience of crime emerges from its specific co-constituted encounter with the social world that both constructs and is constructed by this intertwining of the self and the world. Peter Hunning, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Cal Poly Pomona, developed a phenomenological analysis of racialized police violence in his doctoral dissertation thesis at the University of California, Irvine. There are many more contemporary pieces that engage with phenomenology and violence, as well as phenomenology of violence in different settings. Catherine Gines Bell's contributions to the debate on the phenomenology of violence can be best observed through the revisiting of her piece on reflections on the legacy and future of the continental tradition with regard to the critical philosophy of race, a piece published in the Southern Journal of Philosophy back in 2012. In this piece, Bell argues that the legacy and future of continental philosophy, with regard to the critical philosophy of race, can be seen in prominent canonical philosophical figures, the scholarship of contemporary philosophers, and recent edited collections and book series. She considers how the continental tradition has contributed to the development of the philosophy of race by offering tools from existentialism, phenomenology, and genealogy to emphasize questions of existence, facticity, validity, lived experience, and historicity as they relate to analysis of race, racism, slavery, and colonialism. She also argues that these tools have been used both implicitly and explicitly in the writing of contemporary continental philosophers who theorize about race, and that the critical philosophy of race has impacted and expanded continental philosophy in very significant ways. In her discussion on Arendt's violence-power distinction and Sartre's violence-counter-violence distinction, the phenomenology of violence in colonial and postcolonial contexts, Bell then argues that the theme of violence can be traced throughout Hannah Arendt's major political writings, such as The Human Condition and Our Own Revolution, where she draws connections between war, violence, and necessity, or liberation from necessity. Bell argues that in The Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt examines Europe's uses of violence in concentration camps as well as massacre and imperialism in Africa. And of course, on violence, she condemns the violence of the Black Power movement and of anti-colonialism. Bell's essay takes as starting point the violence-power distinction and then the appropriate uses of violence versus non-violence as presented in Arendt's On Violence. She argues that the distinction between violence and power is misapplied in Arendt's critique of Sartre and Fanon's essays and analysis on anti-colonial revolutionary violence in Algeria. Bell posits that Arendt wrongly interprets Sartre and Fanon and the counter-violence in The Wretched of the Earth and Critique of Dialectical Reason, and her critique of violence proves to be unbalanced. In her view, Bell rejects these analyses because they argue for the use of violence by the oppressed to overcome the violent system of colonialism. Bell contends that it's because they argue for revolutionary violence or counter-violence against their oppressors that Sartre and Fanon are accused of glorifying violence for violence's sake. Bell then considers the possibility that while Arendt's critique of anti-colonial violence is misguided, her analysis might still prove helpful and useful when applied to the post-colonial context, in which former anti-colonial leaders fighting for independence strike out violently against their own people. Instead of assuming that this is a confirmation of Arendt's assertions about anti-colonial violence begetting more violence, she argues that it actually demonstrates the pervasiveness of violence intrinsic to both colonial and neo- and post-colonial circumstances. Thank you for joining us throughout the series of 5 podcasts on phenomenology of violence and its contemporary applications. The authors and works mentioned in this last podcast highlight the possibilities and future trajectories endemic to the study of phenomenology of violence. Full citations of the works discussed can be found at the description section of this podcast. This series started with exploring the possibilities of the application of phenomenology of violence to the contemporary theaters of war across Ukraine. We are ending the series with a wide range of applications and uses of both the concept and the methodology pertaining to phenomenology of violence in different settings of systemic violence. These include racial violence, colonial and postcolonial violence, violence in media, violence and invasions and war, redemptive violence, and descriptions and typologies of violence undertaken from the lens of phenomenological analysis. Our hope is to invite our audience to think further about intentionality, judgment, choice and responsibility in relation to acts of mass violence and our positionality in it. During the 74th NATO summit in July 2023, Ben Wallace, the British Defence Secretary, said, "People want to see a bit more gratitude," and that Ukraine needed to put more emphasis on saying a proper thank you for Western help when he was asked about President Zelensky's complaints on Tuesday that the country had not been issued a firm timetable or a set of conditions for joining NATO yet. Wallace said Ukrainians haste to get all the help they could, but they do not always say they are grateful for what they are receiving. The current UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak immediately distanced himself from Wallace's comments, saying Zelensky has expressed gratitude. Zelensky, on the other hand, said he didn't quite understand Wallace's comments. He also said he would express our words of gratitude personally to the minister if he wishes so. This is a perfect, if not tragic, example of the externalization of the Russian war against Ukraine and the framing of the suffering of others as something that is reduced to provision of arms and ammunition in exchange for repeated statements of gratitude to start with. Arms and ammunition kill. War is not a development project, and Kiev in Ukraine is only about 1,327 kilometers from Vienna, Austria. The core idea here is not the vilification of Russia, which already started after Russia's annexation of Crimea and provision of military support to separatists in eastern Ukraine. It is more about the invisibility of war, turmoil, and displacement, including the dynamics of both internal and external dispossession. Jan Patocka, Hannah Arendt, and Edmund Husserl's political philosophy can help us make sense of the specter of ongoing violent destruction in Ukraine and elsewhere, military or otherwise, slow or immediate, at a time when the general public is curiously lethargic about these ongoing issues, unless it's at their doorsteps. If war is essentially the continuation of politics by other means, as argued by Clausewitz, Hannah Arendt wrote, "Wars, if they should continue to threaten the existence of mankind and hence remain unjustifiable on rational grounds, might disappear, at least in their present form." The Russian bombing of Ukrainian cities and the daily killing of civilians is a reminder that war remains a part of the European landscape and its political world at home, not abroad. The war in Ukraine forces upon us the awareness of the ubiquitous proximity of violence that was experienced by both Patocka and Husserl, as well as by Arendt. An undeclared war erupted between Russia and Ukraine back in 2014, which produced a handful of casualties every day. This, however, fails to stir emotions the way the tragic death of an individual or the statics of mass violence would. Yet, the steady bleeding of human and financial capital since 2014 already amounted to 14,000 dead, 1.5 million people displaced. And prior to the onset of the most recent episode of the war, almost 10% of Ukrainian territory was already laid to waste and ruin. The most recent episode in this ongoing war may validate certain attitudes towards the aggressor in an increasingly militarized society by necessity, now fighting for sheer survival. For many in Ukraine, however, portraits of the enemy often match those of their grandparents, friends, parents, and neighbors. Violence does not need an alien enemy for it to brutalize entire societies. Are we, then, as third parties to this ongoing war, and many other wars that we do not see, hear about, or relate to, are we accountable for the atrocities committed in this and other wars? The most comforting answer has been that although Russia and Ukraine are not members of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, the unilateral declarations of Ukraine accepting ICC's jurisdiction can be exercised for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide in the territory of Ukraine. The lack of an international mechanism to punish the crime of aggression against Ukraine have also triggered calls to create a special tribunal based on the development of international criminal law over the past 80 years. The European Union thus agreed to establish an international center for the prosecution of the crime of aggression and to preserve evidence and to prepare the analysis of the evidence for future prosecutions in national and international trials related to Russia. But casualties in this series of wars is exponentially increasing. The 14,000 military and civilian deaths that occurred during the war in Donbass is now followed by tens of thousands of deaths during the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine and its aftermath. These numbers do not include the missing and captured, or the future civilian casualties related to landmines and other explosive remnants of the war across Ukrainian landscape. Nor do they refer to the total destruction of the infrastructure and poisoning of arable land, and premature deaths resulting from these activities. These numbers do not take into account orphaned and lost children who have been shipped to Russia, nor do they pay attention to those who have been injured and decapacitated for life. For Jan Patocka, the results of the primordial shaking of accepted meaning is not a fall into meaningless, but on the contrary, the discovery of the possibility of achieving a freer, more demanding meaningfulness. With this new possibility, history starts. Patocka finds an intrinsic link between modernity as a particular mode of being and war and totalitarianism as unavoidable consequences of such a mode of being. Hence, Patocka puts forth the dialectic of the light of day and the darkness of night. But as we've seen, Patocka gives preference to the night as the driving force of transgressing modern logic and the defective mode of modern being, which draws crowds to the hellfire of modern warfare. The war in Ukraine brings back home the very essence of Patocka's questions about choice, Arendt's concerns about judgment, and Husserl's call for intersubjectivity and relationality as feeds into intentionality. Thank you for joining us on this journey of exploring the contemporary relevance and applications of phenomenology of violence. You can find a list of citations as well as additional sources in the description section of these podcasts. Please feel free to use them in educational and public settings. These are very important issues, and I hope you enjoyed the series.